Coming up.
You already opened the door to it when your office put out a grand statement in the spring saying that Canada was in a productivity crisis. So now, I'm sorry, Governor, it sounds like you're dodging the question.
2 years ago, the government's own department had warned them that they were going to increase the population so drastically that there was a housing crisis and it would get even worse.
My question is there any enforcement actions against Interact to bring them in compliance?
So I think you're...
Thank you, Governor, for clarifying for everyone that if the carbon tax is removed from things like fuel, the price of these items will in fact go down.
This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
Now I'd like to welcome our witnesses from the Bank of Canada, Governor Tiff Macklem, welcome, and Senior Deputy Governor Carolyn Rogers. Welcome.
Governor, it's been widely reported that our GDP per capita is at its lowest growth rate since the 1930s. That GDP per capita has declined now, according to Stats Canada. It declined in the second quarter. That was the fifth consecutive quarter in a row. Now, also it's been reported Canada lags significantly behind the U.S. in GDP per capita, a trend that's continuing. In fact, Canada is now at 71% of the U.S. economy. We rank 18th in the OECD and 6th out of 7 in the G7, ahead of only Italy. Now, yesterday at a summit in Toronto, you said fixing Canada's productivity problems will likely take a top-to-bottom overhaul of government rules that obstruct people's ability to do their best work and businesses' ability to grow. Monetary policy, fiscal policy, tax policies, competition policy, IP policy, we need to look at those. So my first question has to do with the increase in the capital gains inclusion rate. Are you concerned, or do you find it unhelpful to deal with our productivity crisis, which is the label that the Senior Deputy Governor put on it back in the spring, when the government goes and makes such a massive increase to such an important tax?
Well, you won't be surprised. I'm not going to comment on specific tax measures.
Well, I'm not asking you. I'm asking you as an economist to say whether or not you think an increase in tax like this is going to adversely affect or be unhelpful in solving the productivity crisis that your own office labeled a productivity crisis, break glass. So I'm not sure you can label it as a crisis and not respond to a reasonable question about a major tax increase.
Look, what I will say, coming back to my remarks yesterday, we have a number of framework policies in this country, inflation control policy, fiscal policy, competition policy, tax policy, IP policy. And my message yesterday was really that, yes, we have a serious productivity problem in this country, and there needs to be a concerted effort to look at these framework policies through the lens of productivity. It's really up to elected officials, up to Parliament, up to governments to decide on specific measures, and I'm not going to comment on specific measures, but I do think it would be helpful to look at these through the lens of productivity.
Well, as an economist, I'm sure you're familiar with tax incidence theory. If you put a tax on something, do you get less of it?
Look, as an economist, I understand how taxes work, but I'm the Governor of the Bank of Canada, and I'm not going to comment on specific tax measures.
You already opened the door to it when your office put out a grand statement in the spring saying that Canada was in a productivity crisis. So now, I'm sorry, Governor, it sounds like you're dodging the question. The government took a measure that is going to adversely affect the exact problem that you have warned them they need to solve. So I think it is incumbent on you as the Governor of the Bank of Canada to say, when you increase a tax like this, don't you hurt productivity at a time when we need to be enhancing our productivity?
Look, I think it's incumbent on the government to talk to the tax measures they're taking, not to the Governor of the Bank of Canada.
So you're not gonna answer that one. What about you talked about top to bottom overhaul of government rules, which that obstruct people's ability to do their best work. Could you specifically point out which policies of the government have obstructed people's ability to do their best work and businesses' ability to grow?
So yes, just to sort of back up a little bit to the comments that you're quoting yesterday. So I talked about sort of three big buckets that I think need attention if we're going to tackle this very serious productivity problem. And we've talked about the first one. There's a broad range of framework policies. The second one I somewhat provocatively called the own goals, the obstacles, the things that we've done that were well-intentioned policies but are barriers to increasing productivity growth. And so speaking to those, there are many interprovincial trade barriers. There are interprovincial separate, provincial qualifications for lawyers, for electricians, for doctors that make it more difficult for people to move around the country. We've been very good at bringing immigrants into the country. We're not as good at recognizing their credentials so that they can get the most productive job that they could in Canada. And then the other thing, certainly I hear a lot of, particularly when I'm outside of the country, I often hear from large foreign investors, we're very interested in investing more in Canada. North America is a great place to be. You've got rule of law, you're a stable country, many attractive features, lots of talent, but the timeline to get regulatory approvals is very long, and it's uncertain, and that is a barrier to us
I'm sorry,
investing.
Governor, my time is almost up.
So those are the things I was talking about.
Okay.
Thank you.
Governor, the CMHC, their September numbers show that there's a downward trend in housing starts. In your January monetary policy report, you highlight in there that strong population growth is supporting inflation in rental prices. Since January, have you seen this trend continue? That it's the drastic increase in the population growth that has continued to keep rent inflation high?
I think there's more than one thing that's contributed to rent inflation. Certainly an imbalance between the demand and supply. So and that's the numbers that CMHC is talking about. And inflation. I mean, there's no single variable that has contributed to this. But yeah.
In your report, it doesn't highlight anything else. It just says in here, a larger increase in newcomers than in the past is adding pressure to the structural supply constraint in housing. So one would take it from your own report that is the factor, correct?
Yeah, so what our report says is that there's a structural imbalance between supply and demand, and when you're adding more demand than you're adding supply, you're making that worse.
And so given that, after that January report, did you see any changes, or is it the same reason that has kept rent inflation the way it is?
I don't think there's been a big change since.
I mean, what you can see is that rent inflation has ticked down a little bit, but there's a big stock of rents, and people renew their rents at different times. So it takes a while for new rents to feed into the average rent. What's in the CPI is the average rent increase. So we are starting to see some evidence, and I want to be clear, it's not, we don't have as good data on this, but the new rents, so I'm getting to your question.
Just
the new rents
respectfully,
are
the
coming
rent
down.
inflation has not changed to below 8% for the whole year, which is an indication that nothing has really changed. What I take your monetary report as was a warning in January when you wrote what you wrote. At the same time, 2 years ago, the government's own department had warned them that they were going to increase the population so drastically that there was a housing crisis and it would get even worse. That was the government's own department. Given the numbers that we have of rent inflation being over 8%, my question is, if the government had heeded your warning and its own department's warning, would we not have seen as drastic of a rent inflation as we did? over the past few years, but especially this year since it stayed above 8 the whole year?
Look, I think it's fair to say that the imbalance between demand and supply was further exaggerated by the large population increase that added a lot to demand, and yes, that put upward pressure on rents.
And so my question is, if they had heeded the warnings from the bank and their own department this year, do you think that it would have had less pressure on rent inflation?
If there had been less population growth, there would have been less pressure on rent inflation.
And the reason why I'm saying that is because there was a really damning report yesterday from Food Banks Canada that now there's more than 2 million Canadians going into a food bank in a single month. This is something that when we talk about doorsteps, we see the pain, we hear the pain from Canadians all over. Whereas 40% of someone's paycheck used to be on housing costs, now it's up to 60 and sometimes 80%. There's less money for Canadians. And now we're seeing more food bank usage. And when you look at the population growth, the rapid increase that the government had implied, my question is that with food bank usage going up so much right now, like what is your message to those people? Because, it seemed like my colleagues from the Liberal side had painted such a rosy picture, but 2 million plus Canadians are going to a food bank in a single month.
There's no question that, particularly for people at the lower end of the income distribution, it's been a very tough couple of years. High inflation was particularly concentrated in food, it's in rent. These are necessities. You can't cut back on necessities. They're necessities. The best thing we can do is to get inflation down so that they can have more confidence that their cost of living is not going to keep rising the way it was 2 years ago.
Right.
We've done that. That's good news.
But just to that point, so those people that you're talking about that are lower income, would you not agree that in giving them or raising taxes on them only hurts them further, such as like a carbon tax, or if government spending means that they're going to increase taxes on Canadians, does that not hurt them further?
Look, I really don't want to get into commenting on specific tax measures. I think I've been pretty clear. I completely agree with you that lower income people have been hit hardest by high inflation. And, that is one of the reasons why low inflation is such an important policy.
I just...
My understanding is that Interact's e-transfer service is considered a prominent payment system under the Bank of Canada. That's correct, right? It's been designated. But I also understand that Interact is in non-compliance with the standards that the bank sets out with respect to at least two of the standards. Primarily, one, that the criteria for joining Interact is public. And two, that their pricing mechanism should be risk-based, not volume-based. Now, the problem I have here is that, one, there's no transparency. The bank has requested through the standards that there is transparency. And two, the fee schedule is secret. But we know that it's volume-based based on testimony yesterday at industry committee. So my question is there any enforcement actions against Interact to bring them in compliance?
So I think I think we're talking about two different things. So there is a set of global standards for payment systems that articulate the kinds of things you're talking about. Our enforcement powers relate to Retail Payments Act. So when you talk about an enforcement action.
Well, you regulate e-transfers, correct? Or they're considered a prominent payment system for e-transfers, right?
Yes.
And the Bank of Canada has listed that the standards it expects those entities, the prominent payment systems, to comply with. Interact is not in compliance. They've admitted it. It's not a secret.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, is the bank pressuring them to do the things that you've asked them to do?
Yes, we are working with them.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, you used the word enforcement measure, so yes. Are we working with Interact on those standards? Yes.
I guess I would say you have political cover to push them much further because it's 10 years since the bank has admitted that modernization to retail payments has a significant economic upside. And if we're worried about productivity, I would think that you could lean on this organization and Payments Canada, which, by the way, gave a sole source contract to an entity that's completely ripe with conflicts of interest, which is owned by the banks, right? They have an incentive to not modernize to protect that profit pool, but they're in non-compliance. So I'm very glad to hear that you're working with them.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is we are working closely with Payments Canada. I mean, having a fast payment system in Canada is an important step for productivity. It's an important step for our economy. It's an objective that we support.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll switch back. My understanding is it clear from or would it be safe to say from your testimony that the fight against inflation is not over, that there is risk that it could reaccelerate? Is that a fair assessment?
I'd say we've reached a very important milestone. We've got inflation low again.
But is the fight over?
It.
Is the fight over?
No.
Okay. So there's provincial elections all across the country. There's a federal election coming up at least within the next year. You've got provinces promising to send people checks. You have the PBO saying that the government's blowing through its deficit target. Sounds to me like a lot of fiscal stimulus. What recommendations would you have for governments who are considering a lot of fiscal stimulus when the fight against inflation is not over? Do you support additional fiscal stimulus?
So, normally we don't comment at all on fiscal policy. When inflation was high and we were working very hard to get inflation down, we did express concern that if there was a lot more spending, and in particular if fiscal spending was well above potential growth, that could make it more difficult to get inflation back down. We've now got inflation back down, so I'm really not feeling the need to comment on fiscal policy.
So
really, fiscal policy is your job. Monetary policy is
fair
your
enough.
job.
Would you say to tread carefully? Would that be a fair recommendation that you would provide politicians who can't help themselves but spend, including provincial governments? I'm an equal offender here.
Tread carefully, but look, I'm not here to give you fiscal policy advice. We are here to talk about monetary policy.
Thank you, Governor.
And I would say to you, when I talk to my constituents, some of them will say, Julie, I'm worried that the carbon tax, so our carbon pricing, is making everything expensive. Governor, one of the misinformations that's out there, or disinformation, is that if we eliminate the carbon pricing or carbon tax, all the prices will go down. If we eliminate our carbon pricing, will all prices go down?
Well, if the tax is not applied to it, there's no direct effect. I mean, there could be an indirect effect, but there's no direct effect.
Sorry, there's no direct effect on what?
Well, I mean, I've talked many times about, our estimates. So when we do it, what we do is we look at the incidence on the fuel categories that the carbon tax affects. So if you take the carbon tax off, yes, the prices of those fuel categories will come down. But, that's going to be the direct incidence of getting rid of the carbon tax on prices.
It won't be that all prices go down. So food prices go down, transportation prices go down beyond the fuel price. Like the expectation, and there's this belief out there that it is the carbon pricing that somehow has caused everything to be expensive. So if you eliminate the carbon tax, everything will then go back to normal and the prices will be back to normal. That is honestly the belief that is out there. So for my constituents, if we eliminate the carbon pricing or carbon tax, would all the prices go down? No. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Governor, for clarifying for everyone that if the carbon tax is removed from things like fuel, the price of these items will in fact go down. So that was, I think, helpful to have on the record. Would that go for everything, all other sort of products that are tied to this? So if a truck that transports food no longer has the tax applied to it, then we are easing the input cost on food, for example?
Estimate of the secondary effects, but the direct effects on overall inflation are relatively modest. The secondary effects are going to be even more modest. So, they're. I'm not saying there aren't some products where that could be important, but if you look, what we're looking at is CPI inflation, everything in the basket, and when you look at it that way, the secondary effects are going to be de minimis.
Back to at the very end of your response to Mr. Morantz's last question, you were beginning to talk about timelines for project approvals and the impact that has on productivity, the drag on productivity. So I'd like you to maybe complete your answer, if you'd like to, and talk about how regulatory timelines create delay, which creates a drag on productivity, which is where we get this declining per capita GDP that we have in Canada.
So, look, we have well-intentioned regulations at different levels, federal, provincial, municipal in this country. These are well-intentioned regulations. They want to make sure that these investments are in the best interests. The difficulty is at times we have overlapping, sometimes even conflicting regulatory approval processes. They're tough for investors, people who want to build, to navigate, and there can be considerable uncertainty in how long it's going to take. So,
if I may,
so what that does is it scares investors off.
Indeed. So delays on that capital will go somewhere else. For example, United States. Yeah, and the gap in investment, the investment deficit with the United States, the difference between American investment in Canada and Canadian investment in the United States is now. Do you have a
I don't have the number in front of me, but
okay.
There's no question that too many companies, so foreign capital, even some Canadian capital, is going to the United States because they can get faster regulatory approvals.
Right, and we've heard at this committee that difference is almost $500 billion. That sound about right and roughly.
Yeah, I don't have
correct.
a number, but it's a big number.
Okay, so can you tell us about? Would you care to name some of the specific regulatory obstacles to investment?
No, I'm not going to get into sort of specific line by line issues. I think that the message is we need to look at this from a whole of country point of view, and these are well intentioned. But I think where we can streamline the process, provide more certainty, that's going to encourage investment. The productivity problem, it's a long-standing problem. It's going to take. This is something, along with getting rid of interprovincial trade barriers. These are some things that we know what the problem. We know there's a problem. We know what it is. It's going to take some concerted effort to cut through it. But it's something we could do that, if we can do it, could have pretty good return in the short run.
So, is it wise then to increase capital gains taxes when you are in an acknowledged productivity crisis and an investment crisis, where investment is going to other peer countries and not into Canada? Is that a wise time to raise a tax on investment?
I think I've said everything I'm going to say on that question.
Okay, I'll take that as no, that it is not a good time to raise a tax. But I don't know if I have any time left for another question.
10 seconds.
Then any C69, is that a good one as far as barriers to investment then?
I'm not going to comment on specific legislation.
Thank you.
I just wanted to circle back to what we were talking about earlier. I just had a chance to go look up what the mandate of the Bank of Canada is. It says that your mandate is to promote the economic and financial welfare of Canada, which begs the question, when you come to the Finance Committee and members of Parliament ask you questions related to the economic and financial welfare of Canada, that you should answer them. And what I'm also surprised about is that when I had my first round, you said you would not answer questions with respect to fiscal policy, that you were here to talk about monetary policy. But then when a Liberal MP asked you a question about fiscal policy, specifically what would happen if the carbon tax was eliminated and its effect on prices, you answered that question. So I'm starting to feel like if a Liberal asks you a question about fiscal policy, you're willing to answer it, and if a Conservative asks you, you're not willing to answer it. So I'm going to try again. Okay, fair enough. I withdraw.
Thank you.
But I would like to ask, fair enough. I would like to ask a hypothetical question, which is what my colleague asked you, though. If you make the assumption, based on economic policy, that increasing the capital gains tax would have an adverse effect on GDP, and this is just a hypothetical, would that have a negative impact on tax revenues for the government?
Your question is, if the economy slows, will tax revenues be lower? The answer is yes.
The answer is yes. If the economy slows, the tax revenues will be less.
Everything else equal, yes.
Yeah. Okay, so the government has projected that the increase in the capital gains inclusion rate will raise about $19 billion over 5 years. And again, this is just a hypothetical. If in fact it becomes true, and there are other economists that are willing to speak to this, Jack Mintz was here and Ian Lee all said what you don't want to say, that it would adversely affect the GDP. Would it be fair to say that the projection of the government is not accurate in terms of the tax revenues received?
You have to take your tax projections, your fiscal projections up with the fiscal authorities, not the Bank of Canada.
Why would you?
I will happy to speak about our projections.
So why would you answer a question about fiscal policy from a Liberal
I have
MP?
answered, the reason I objective is I have answered many questions about the carbon tax from you and from your colleagues.
But arguably the capital gains tax is bigger than that. It's billions of dollars out of the economy.
Yes, but the carbon tax is, has a very direct effect on inflation. We are, if you look at our forecast, when we publish our monetary policy report, we actually have a line that shows the impact of the carbon tax on inflation. It has a very direct effect on the thing that we are charged with controlling. And so, yes, I have a responsibility to respond because it is directly affecting our remit.
So we had Ian Lee here who projected that the capital gains inclusion rate would will increase the cost to Canada. It will cause a decline of 3% in GDP. Do you agree with that assessment?
I'm glad you've got experts coming in and giving you good advice on these issues. These are really important questions, and you should get the best advice from the best experts.
So at least in this context, you're not willing to promote the economic and financial welfare of Canada by answering a question of elected officials about a major tax. Is that correct?
I am directing questions on tax to the Government of Canada, to the Department of Finance. That is their responsibility. Our responsibility is monetary policy.
With the greatest of respect, Governor, I would suggest that when you come to the Finance Committee and elected officials ask you reasonable questions, that you answer them. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair, I would like some clarification. Mr. Morantz has said that he withdrew his comments earlier, so does that mean that they are struck from the record of this meeting?
What I will say, P.S. Bendayan, is we expect respect and decorum for the witnesses that come before our committee. I believe the governor has made himself more than available. He's here for 2 hours, and the senior deputy governor, and the governor has answered MP Morantz, and MP Morantz did retract what he had to say earlier.
In fact, I'll go farther, Mr. Chair. I apologize for that. I really do. But I think my question is reasonable, and I think you should be answering.
Point of order, I believe that Mr. Morantz's time is up, and if the Conservatives would like to go back to their partisan attacks on the Governor of the Bank of Canada, they may do so outside of this forum.
Thanks, Chair. Since I have a limited time, Governor, I just wanted to ask you, yesterday you had commented about fixing Canada's productivity problems. One of the things you highlighted was about having foreign credentials recognized that could help people get into the workforce. I know there's many brilliant immigrants in this country that end up driving Uber or taxi that we know of that could be doctors, nurses, engineers. Would you agree that if we had something like a national program in which someone could take a test or prove their skill in a certain amount of time, something like 60 days, something like that, so that they can be trained here in Canada and their credentials could be recognized. And after that point, whether it's a pass or a fail, if they pass, they could go into that field of work, such as a doctor or nurse, that could help not only our healthcare system, but with the productivity issues that we're having today.
I think that's the kind of innovative thinking we need. Whether it's a national or a mutual recognition of provinces, yes, that's the kind of thing we need.
I'm happy you just endorse our common sense conservative leader Pierre Poilievre's National Blue Seal program when he becomes Prime Minister. So thank you for that. I wanted to move on we saw that the Parliamentary Budgeting Officer recently came out with his report that the government is going to overrun their budget by $7 billion. What I wanted to know from you is that helpful in any way, not just for yourself, but for overall to our, fight in bringing down inflation? Does that help in any way? And if that trend continues, is that going to make things harder?
As I said, we're back to low inflation. The economy is actually in some excess supply.
Question is just because that's happening, does it mean that you give yourself some free reins to spend
what
more?
it means is from the narrow perspective of monetary policy, there's less sort of tension between monetary and fiscal policy. When you're above target and you're trying to get it back, spending more than planned creates tension. When you're back to target, you've got some excess supply. It's less of a source. It's not my role to comment on what is the best fiscal policy.
Would you say it's not helpful?
As I say, I don't really feel I need to comment on fiscal policy.
I'll move on because I only have a limited amount of time. I know the bank likes to, give information that's digestible for Canadians. To Canadians watching today, in your opinion, is the economy today good or bad?
The economy is soft.
Okay. What does that mean for the 2 million Canadians?
It's not bad. It's not good.
Yeah.
It's soft.
Yeah. So
it needs to strengthen going forward.
But if we talk in relative terms of everyday Canadians that we know are suffering today, which you've acknowledged, it's the 2 million Canadians going to a food bank. It's the Tim Horton workers working in Timmins. And with GDP per capita coming down, what do you think they're thinking when they hear that soft? Like, what does that mean to them?
Well, actually, we have a pretty good sense of what they're thinking. We survey Canadians. What we're seeing is on financial stress. Yes, there's still some financial stress. They're feeling a little less stressed than they felt. They're feeling a little more optimistic than they felt. Are they feeling good? No.
Yeah.
But they're feeling a little better than they felt.
Right,
and we think that's going to continue to improve.
We established that those rent prices have gone up and it's staying stubbornly high. And when you look at the food bank users, 70% of them are renters. And they're the ones whose paychecks are 80% are being taken up by that. 1 in 5 of those food bank users are actually people who are employed. And food bank usage has doubled since 2019, doubled. It went from 1 million to more than 2 million people. Like, what does that say to those people or the state of our economy?
Well, I share your concern. There's no question that people at the lower end of income distribution are having a tougher time. Many of those are renters. If you look at financial stress, it's actually concentrated more in people that don't have mortgages, tend to be obviously they're renters. Whether it's their car loan, their credit card, that's where we are seeing more stress. That is a concern.